This meeting is being recorded.
Please be seated. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. This is our hearing for IPR 2023-00842. I'm Judge Baer. With me should be Judges Ahmed and McShane. There's Judge Ahmed, Judge McShane. Give me a nod if you can hear us. Looks good. Judge McShane, good. Okay. Let's get the parties' appearances. If we could, please, who do we have for petitioner?
John Trimble, with me is Sam Brooks. He'll be doing the argument today.
Great, thank you, Mr. Brooks. Who do we have for patent owner?
Brandon Peace from Volpe and Kodak will be arguing. Also with me is Conrad LA. We'll just be observing.
Great, thank you, Mr. Peace. We set forth the hearing for today's, we set forth the procedure rather for today's hearing in our trial order. So I trust you all have that and reviewed that. Just to make sure everybody knows how this will go, we give the parties each 60 minutes aside. I believe petitioner, we have a lead practitioner with us, so we're going to give you another 15 minutes. That's great. We have the full record in front of us. We have your slides in front of us. But if you would, just if you're referring to something, just to keep the record clear, if you would mention what slide you're referring to, or if you're referring to something in the record, refer to that record document if you would. I think that's everything. Does counsel for petitioner have any questions before we get going?
No, Your Honor.
Great. And counsel for patent owner, any questions before we get going?
No, Your Honor.
All right. With that, we're ready to begin. Petitioner Mr. Brooks, correct? You'll be presenting?
That's correct.
Great. Whenever you're ready. First of all, do you wish to reserve any time for rebuttal?
Yes, please. 15 minutes.
Great. So we'll put 60 minutes on the clock. And you may begin whenever you are ready.
Thank you.
Your Honor, before we begin, it looks like we've lost Judge Ahmed. He seems to be locked up.
All right, let's give it just a minute while that's booting. Judge Ahmed can hear us. It's just that the video is frozen, so let's go ahead and proceed. Judge Ahmed, it looks like we're kind of getting it back anyway. So Judge Ahmed, let us know if you can't hear us. Thank you.
I can hear you.
Great, okay.
Good afternoon. Today, we're here to discuss U.S. patent number 9353454, and specifically, Claim 1 of that patent. Within Claim 1, there are two limitations at issue with respect to our petitioner's first argument.
And again, counsel, if you would just let us know what slide you're on to the extent you can remember, we'd appreciate it.
Yes, Your Honor. Turning to slide 6, the first element we'd like to discuss is wherein the module is further configured to transmit the flow control signal through the serial link and the connector without passing the flow control signal through the second buffer. We will show that a person having ordinary skill in the art would be informed that the combination of Vangemert and Copeland, as presented in the petition, teaches all elements of Claim 1. Vangemert expressly teaches each of these elements, and this is fully supported by the testimony of Dr. Kalianides. Dr. Grimsrud confirms the testimony of Dr. Kalianides, provides further support to show these teachings, and rebuts the patent owner's unsupported conclusory positions to the contrary. Dr. Grimsrud testimony is fully supported and unrebutted, other than by non-evidentiary conclusory attorney argument. Returning to Bangamert, which is the primary reference cited against Claim 1, and shown on slide 7, Bangamert expressly teaches transmitting a flow control signal through the serial link and the connector without passing the flow control signal through the second buffer. The claim language shown in the second bullet on slide 7 states that when the receive controller receives a control word indicating that a remote node wishes to transmit data, the buffer credit manager is enabled, and the transmit controller begins transmitting buffer credit control words in response to a credit signal from the buffer credit manager. Also shown on slide 7 is a reproduction of figure 4, annotated as shown in the petition. As shown, element 412 is a transmit controller.
I'm sorry, Council. This is Judge McShane. First of all, apologies, because I can see I'm blinking on and off in the hearing room. I don't know what's going on there. I think it's just a data transmission glitch. But let me ask you a question about the flow control signal. You just referred to the buffer credit control words. And when I was reading, I believe it's page 31 of the petition, I was a little confused as to what you're asserting the flow control signal is exactly. And also, and this is sort of, I'm giving you a compound question here. Can you explain to me how the buffer credit control words work with the buffer credit signal? Because you refer to both of those terms when you're talking about the flow control signal on page 31 of your petition.
Yes. If you look at figure 4, the buffer credit manager, 418, is configured to generate buffer credit signals. This is also referred to in the first bullet point on slide 7. Buffer credit manager generates a signal when there's sufficient space in the buffer, which is then transmitted to the transmit controller. This signal is packaged into the buffer credit control word, which is then sent out via the transmit controller to the encoder, which then subsequently goes out through the transceiver as shown on the left-hand side of figure 4, and then out into the rest of the circuitry of Bangamert, and then thusly out on a serial link. Could you repeat the second part of your question? I apologize.
I'm sorry. What I was asking is, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, thank you. But can you explain to me how the buffer credit control words work with the buffer credit signal? Can you explain that interaction?
Yes. So the buffer credit signal informs the transmit controller to begin transmitting buffer credit control words. These buffer credit control words are what are sent to the, in this case, device wishing to transmit, informing it that it can therefore or thereby transmit data to the receiving device. Bangamert operates on a buffer credit type flow control mechanism as opposed to other types of flow control mechanisms, where as the amount of space in the buffer becomes sufficient to accept new data words, these are sent only upon there being a credit provided to the receiving device, or excuse me, the device wishing to transmit. There may be multiple credits issued. There may be a point where there are no credits had by the other device, and the buffer credit control word provides that buffer credit such that the other device knows that it can provide said transmission.
So would it be fair to characterize the buffer credit signal as the internal credit signal, and the credit control word is what is sent to the other device to control the other device? Is that a fair characterization?
That's correct, Your Honor.
And is that in the record? Is that just my understanding? Is there expert testimony on that? Does Bangamert say that explicitly?
Yes. So give me 1 second here.
Sure, take your time. could point you to, in the interest of time, to column 4, roughly lines 8 through 20-ish of Vandermeer. Is that the relevant section, or is there something more explicit on
No,
this?
within Vanguard, column 4, lines 8 through, say, 23 are the main sections regarding how this system works. So again, when the receive controller receives a control word indicating that a remote node wishes to transmit data, again, I'm citing from Vanguard directly, the buffer credit manager is enabled and the transmit controller begins transmitting buffer credit control words in response to a credit signal from the buffer credit manager. If you follow up to secondary paragraph in column 4, it does describe the generation of the credit signal, which is based on determining that there is sufficient space within the buffer to send the signal. So the transmit controller is effectively creating the buffer credit control word to send the device. It's packaging what it's receiving from the buffer credit manager and outputting it to the to the output.
So something Judge McShane was referring to in your petition, it struck me that you were a little bit less than clear of whether it was the buffer credit signal or the buffer credit control word or some combination of both of them that was the actual control word. It seems like in your petition or reply, you clarified that. No, it's just the buffer credit control word. My question for you is, can you clarify now that it is only the buffer credit control word, not some combination of the two, that is the claimed signal?
That's correct, Your Honor. And you are correct that we did try to clarify that in our reply.
But now it's just the buffer credit control word, so we can ignore and sort of jettison all of patent owner's arguments that the buffer credit signal doesn't meet the claims because it is not transmitted. We don't even, you would concede that. It doesn't matter. We're only relying on the buffer credit control word. Is that correct?
That's correct, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Moving to slide 8, Dr. Calianides, who has extensive experience in the serial communication space, testified that a person having ordinary skill in the art would understand that the buffer credit control word of Vanguard does not pass through the transmit buffer. He testified that Vanguard provides a fast, low latency fiber channel system by sending the buffer credit control word directly to the encoder from the transmit controller without passing through the transmit buffer.
Actually, Mr. Brooks, if we could back up before we get to the expert's articulation of what's likely here and what he thinks is going on. If we could go back to, I want to talk about Vanguard's express disclosures one more time. In your briefs, you focus on the word begins a lot. That is Vanguard, column 4, line 15. It says, transmit controller begins transmitting buffer credit control words in response. You frequently highlighted that word begins. I don't understand why that helps your argument, because I understand the dispute to be not where it begins, but whether it begins there, transmits to a buffer, right, namely the transmit buffer 410 of Vanguard, and comes back to the transmit controller. So can you explain to me the argument about how that word begins, or the two words begins transmitting, helps your argument that that word never hits the transmit buffer? Is my question clear?
Yes, Your Honor. When we read the passage in the second bullet on slide 7, and our focus on begins transmitting buffer credit control words, there is no intermediate step discussed. It is simply, it receives a signal, and then it is configured to begin transmitting buffer credit control words in response to a credit signal. There is other portions of Vanguard, which we can discuss, that discuss which control words are placed into the transmit buffer.
But those data control words, those aren't generated in the transmit buffer, are they?
I believe that you're referring to the data, the control words that are transmitted with the data packet.
That's right. So we're now looking at Vanguard column 3, line 49. It says a transmit controller retrieves control words and data frames from transmit buffer 410 and forwards them to an encoder. Now, I understand your argument that those are data control words, those aren't data flow control words. That's fine. But what I'm asking is, how does that word begin help you? I don't think anybody's arguing that any control words, be they flow control words or data control words, are generated in the transmit buffer. So why does it help you that it says the transmit controller begins transmitting buffer credit control words? Isn't the question not who begins it, but whether the transmit controller begins to transmit those buffer credit control words, sends them to the transmit buffer, and then sends them back, as is the case with the data control words? Isn't that the issue?
Yes, that is the issue.
So how does that word begins help you?
I think begins transmitting buffer credit control words has to be looked at in context with the goals of Vanguard, which are to provide low latency systems.
No, I understand that, but is it that it begins transmitting? Is that the point? That it's transmitting? It's not buffering? Is it transmitting? Or is it the fact that the word is actually generated in the transmit controller that matters?
I believe it is that the word is actually generated in the transmit controller.
How does that determine whether it then gets sent to the transmit buffer or not?
Again, as we pointed out, there's no reason why it would send it to the transmit buffer. The transmit buffer is associated with the data control. It is, as stated, it's coupled to the I/O bus. Transmit controller receives the data and has to build these data packets along with the control words there. A flow control signal, such as a buffer credit control word, needs to be output quickly. And there are several reasons for that. If we turn to the testimony of Dr. Grimsrud, he provides several reasons why one would not put the flow control signal into the transmit buffer. For one, it goes against the goal of fiber channel and described in Vanguard. We're now referring to slide 10. Dr. Grimsrud testified that doing so is adverse to sound engineering practices and it would add unnecessary steps and increase latency over a system in which the transmit controller begins transmitting the buffer credit control word in response to the credit signal. Turning to slide 11, one of the first reasons for this, Dr. Grimsrud testified regarding creating an unbounded system. This unbound system occurs where, in part, data word sizes may be unknown and the buffer size may be quite large. In this instance, where a control word is put into the transmit buffer, it would be unknown when the transmit word, or excuse me, the control word, the buffer credit control word, would be transmitted. This creates data validation issues as well as design issues, and that would never be known when the flow control signal may actually be transmitted across the link. A further example of a fault with putting it in the transmit buffer would be the occurrence of a deadlock condition. Turning to, as described on slide 12, turning to slide 13, we have the exact example outlaid by Dr. Grimsrud. The illustrations to the right are illustrative of that example that he provided. In the image shown on slide 13, there's device A and device B. In this instance, we'll assume it's a duplex communication between the two as laid out in the example. In this instance, both devices may be transmitting data to one another or to other devices, because fiber channel is not a direct point-to-point signal, but rather a, I believe, ring-type architecture. So in this instance, we see that the first in the buffer, the transmit buffer, are the data packets, both in device A and device B, and both have a buffer credit control word in the transfer buffer behind the data packet. However, in this condition, both device A and device B have no available buffer credits. Accordingly, as the buffer credit control word has no path to exit the buffer as it is placed behind the data packet, it is conceivable that data would stop between the two devices as there is no credit and no means to provide a new credit to either device. This clarifies why we believe it's important to say that when it begins transmitting, that means it is getting that signal and immediately begins transmitting it without putting it in a buffer behind the data.
So it's really that it begins transmitting. That's the key. It says it's enabled, and the very next words, before it says anything about passing it to a buffer, is it begins transmitting, right?
Correct.
So it's really the combination of begins and transmitting that's the key?
Yes, Your Honor.
That's helpful, thank you.
Again, returning to slide 8, Dr. Calianides supported the position by the petitioner in the interpretation of Vangemert, noting that to do otherwise would go against Vangemert for providing a fast, low latency fiber channel system by sending the buffer credit control word directly to the encoder. In fact, Mr. Lee seemed to agree, stating that the buffer credit system of Vangemert ensures efficient and timely flow control in the network, including allowing for the sender to adjust its data transmission rate in real time, as shown on slide 9. And the comments of Mr. Lee can be found in Exhibit 2002 at paragraph 55 and paragraph 78 through 79. As put out in petitioner's reply, Dr. Grimsrud further put out testimony supporting Dr. Calianides' previous positions. Dr. Grimsrud has extensive experience in the serial control world, and in fact went on to become a lead founding member of SATA, which is a subsequent serial communication protocol. Therefore, we believe his testimony should carry substantial weight. Again, as noted in slide 10, Dr. Grimsrud testified that storing the buffer credit controller in the transmit buffer would be illogical and adverse to sound engineering practices, as doing so creates unnecessary steps and increases latency. We've already discussed the issues and the examples provided by Dr. Grimsrud, highlighted in slides 11 and 12 and 13. Dr. Grimsrud, in further support of his arguments, cites the Tachyon article. The Tachyon article was cross-referenced in, Patent Owners Exhibit 2012, and was the immediately following article in that journal, and shares a complementary author.
Mr. Bush, just to cut to the chase of the party's dispute on this, is it your position that the Tachyon article discloses sending control words without touching the buffer, or is it your position that the Tachyon article teaches that Vangemert teaches the control word not touching the second article?
It is more of the latter. Dr. Grimsrud relied on Vangemert to supply additional evidence as to how a fiber channel system would occur.
But why does Vangemert describe how why does the article, the Tachyon article, describe how Vangemert works? Is there anything affirmative in the Tachyon article that says this is the only way to do it, and any disclosure of, sending a control word has to go this way, or isn't it just a preferred way to do it?
The Tachyon article describes fiber channel operation, and fiber channel is a standard. Vangemert uses the fiber channel standard to communicate. Vangemert's main point of invention is how the credits are calculated within the system upon receiving data and other buffer credit control words from other devices.
So your standards argument is an interesting one. I have two questions for you. That indeed, the Tachyon article is a standard and Vangemert uses that standard. One, was this argument in your briefs? And two, in addition, can you point us to those affirmative disclosures that it is a standard and that Vangemert uses that standard? You don't have to do that on the fly right now, that you can save that for your rebuttal time, but that would be something that would be helpful to us.
Thank you, Ron. I will save that for.
But again, I think we can save the argument of what the Tachyon article teaches. I don't think there's any dispute about that. It's just a question of whether that is a standard that is used in Vangemert or that is sort of a standalone reference.
Yes. On that note, based on your comments, would you prefer to move along from Tachyon?
I think that would be helpful, yes. I would like you to hit that issue if you would in rebuttal, but I think we can move on.
Yes, Your Honor. So moving to the next element of claim 1, as shown in slide 20, is the element of where in the module is operable to generate a flow control signal in response to the amount of data stored in the first buffer equaling or exceeding the fill amount. In this, one moment, hold my notes here. First, we note that patent owner waived this argument and only filed any comments to it in their SIR reply, which is subject to petitioner's motion to strike. The patent owner did not address any of patent owner's arguments regarding this element, in particular with respect to Vangemert, in their response. It was addressed for the first time in the SIR reply. As noted in our motion to strike, this is prejudiced petitioner, that we were not able to depose Mr. Lee about any teachings thereof, and further, we're not able to brief this matter in more detail.
All right, let's assume you're right. And now I'm going to give you your best chance right now to describe to me how Vangemert affirmatively discloses its trigger being in response to meeting or excelling a fill amount. Okay, so this is your opportunity, because I thought it was relatively clear from the petition the difference. One says meeting or excelling, and the reference itself says when it's less than. That seemed pretty clear from the petition. And you're saying, well, we were prejudiced by the not raising it. So here's your opportunity to explain to me how Vangemert's disclosure is an affirmative disclosure of the claim limitation, which is meeting or excelling.
Thank you. Vangemert recites generating a flow control signal in response to the amount of data stored in the first buffer equaling or exceeding the fill amount, equaling being the key word. The fill amount of Vangemert is cited in the petition at pages 27 to 28, and we're on slide 21. The fill amount of Vangemert is equal to the available buffer capacity less committed buffer space as determined by the Buffer Credit Manager 418. The Buffer Credit Manager 418 generates a credit upon determining that the committed buffer space is less than the available buffer capacity by at least the size of the one data frame. This credit is then packaged into the buffer credit control word by the transmit controller, as described previously. The generation of this credit signal and the subsequent packaging into the buffer credit control word teaches generating a flow control signal in response to the amount of data stored in the first buffer equaling the fill amount.
So the key disclosure is this special equaling case, right? You would agree that Vangemert signals are only sent when there is sufficient space, not when it's exceeding the space. So the key time in this, I see there your slide. What is the slide number there?
Sorry, slide 22.
So it's this special equaling case.
Correct.
So where is Vangemert's disclosure that when you have completely run out of room, you come to that exact cap space, this exact fill amount, equaling the fill amount, that you are still going to send that control word credit that allows data flow?
I believe that was described above, that it teaches it.
What slide number are you on?
I'm on slide 21. The buffer credit manager generates a credit upon determining the committed buffer space, the fill amount, is less than the available buffer capacity by at least the size of one data frame. So if we turn to slide 22, we provided figures here that represent the operation of both the 454 first buffer and the Vangemert transmit buffer. In the example shown on slide 22, neither device is sending a flow control signal. Vangemert has data that has exceeded the fill amount. The 454 buffer has data that is below the fill amount. Turning to slide 23, both equaling the fill amount. So the 454 buffer has gotten more full and rises to the level of the fill amount, whatever the predetermined threshold of the 454 first buffer is. It will then generate a flow control signal. Similarly, Vangemert, the data has fallen to the point where it equals the fill amount and then transmits its flow control signal.
Why, if you're right up at the cap, you're right up at Vangemert's cap, why would Vangemert send a credit token saying, go ahead and send some more data? Wouldn't that then exceed the amount of available space? It doesn't make sense to me that once you hit that fill spot, that you send another signal that says, go ahead and transmit because there's room for more data. Can you explain to me or show me where that would be in the reference?
Sure, you can look to column 4, effectively column 4 lines 24 through roughly 50. So I think that
Give us just a second to get caught up. We're talking about Vangamort, column 4, 54?
24 through 50.
Thanks.
So I think it's important here to understand the context of Vangamort and what it is trying to do with its actual point of novelty, which is to ensure that it can send a flow control signal, a buffer credit control word at the earliest possible moment. So it knows that predetermined fill mount, again, if we return to slide 21, is generated when the buffer credit manager determines that the committed buffer space, the fill amount, is less than the available buffer capacity by at least one frame of size of one data frame. So yes, it may be right up against the fill amount, but it knows the size of the data words that will be coming in and knows that it can send a buffer credit without exceeding the capacity of the buffer. That is why, as shown again in slide 23, upon it equaling the fill amount, it will send the buffer credit control word. Once it is at the fill amount or any point below the fill amount, as long as the size, the available amount above the predetermined fill amount is sufficient for the size of, is at least equal to the size of one data frame. You can also look at column 4, lines 16 through 23. So in receive buffer, at the beginning of exchange, the receive buffer is empty of data frames. The buffer credit manager is provided with a negotiated frame size and the receive buffer capacity and is expected to generate and manage number of buffer credits at least equal to the maximum receive buffer capacity divided by the frame size.
So I think we're familiar with now the arguments with respect to Vangamort. And I think one of your arguments is, look, even if Vangamort touches that buffer, we still have Copeland, which is a different reference, which describes a control word that doesn't, undisputably, doesn't touch the second buffer. So why don't we move to Copeland's disclosure and petitioner's arguments about Copeland's disclosure of this control word. In particular, whether Copeland's control word is passed over a serial link is really, I think, the key issue.
Understood. So we've addressed that.
I mean, I don't mean to cut you off. If
Oh,
there's
no.
more you have to say on Vangamort, you're welcome to say more.
No, that is perfectly fine, Your Honor. Excuse me, we discussed this a bit more on our later slides. So patent owner originally brought the argument that Copeland does not disclose a serial link, I think a one-sentence remark in the response, and then moved it in the reply to addressing the combination of Copeland and Dobson, but I think it's relevant at either point. The patent owner is attempting to read serial link, or read in several narrowing limitations to the claimed serial link, stating, trying to attempt that it's related to the data connection that carries both the serial data and the flow control signal. It appears that they're asserting that it's only the twisted pairs or the data lines that constitute the serial link. However, the claim itself recites a simple serial link between two devices. This claim was not offered for construction in the petitioner's initial response, nor was there any leave taken to amend. So we're kind of left with plain and ordinary meaning of the serial link. Copeland, turning to slide 45, we can see how the operation of Copeland. The flow control output, 165, is highlighted to the right of figure 1 as line 165. This is how the flow control output is generally understood to be generated in Copeland. It is provided to the serial port line buffer, then passes 50 through 53 out through the connector 20. This connector 20 also receives all of the data flow from the UART 14 over line 28, which is somewhat difficult to see in view of the red box, but all of the data and the flow control signal pass through the serial port line buffer and then output to the connector and then across the serial link. Copeland notes that it does not show the link to another device, but describes it as being connected to perhaps a modem facilitating duplex communication.
I don't think opposing counsel would argue that it doesn't go through a serial link connector. I mean, Copeland itself calls it a serial link connector, or serial connector, I think.
Yeah, serial interface connector.
Serial interface connector. My question to you, so the real question is, if you have a bundle of wires and it does serial data transport along, it also has some other pins, is that whole thing called a serial link, or is just the wire called a serial link? I understand your position. I think I understand Pat Motor's position. Is there any record evidence of how a person of skill in the art, or more importantly, I think, how a reference describes a serial link? In other words, is the serial link anything that transmits serial data plus other stuff called a serial link, or is it something else? Is it, just the serial data lines are called a serial link, where those other wires are called something else?
We would argue that it is, again, the actual wire that carries. This, if you give me one moment, to find my particular notes on this issue. The 454 patent relies on the disclosure of the 214 patent, from which it depends for its support of the serial link. The 214 patent, while describing in some embodiments the twisted duplex lines, offers other options for the serial link. One refers to,
Take your time. If you could give us a exhibit
yes,
reference number, and this is, we're now no longer talking about exhibit 1001, we're talking about the other reference, right? The
that's correct.
related patents. If you could give us a,
So if we look at exhibit 1010 at lines 39 to 45 as a first example.
what column, please?
Sorry, I believe it is column 4. Column 8.
And the lines again, please?
Column 8, lines 39 through 45. Describes that ASIC 58 communicates to receiver transmitter 106, which provides a physical interface through a terminal connector to cable 4046. Cable 4046 is further referenced in the 214, and I'll find that citation in a moment, as the link.
Does it say serial link or link?
I believe it says link in the 214.
That strikes me as important. I don't think anybody's arguing that it's a link. I think the question is it a serial link because it's got parallel aspects to it? But if it says serial link, that would be significant. And again, that's something you're welcome to address now or address in your rebuttal time.
Thank you. So the terminal connector is connected to cable 4046, which is interchanged with, again, link, and I can find those exact citations here in a moment.
I believe they're called simplex links in the reference. It's column 7, line 26. something else that would be helpful, you're welcome to point to it, but if that's helpful, that's where they're called simplex links.
Yes, so they go from cable to simplex link. They're connected to a 20-pin connector, certainly more than 4, capable of carrying these high-speed signals. The 214 patent further recites that while twin axial lines offer high performance, twisted pairs, or other transmission media may be used. And again, let me one moment to find that citation. Oh, excuse me, finish the quote. So the transmission distance is not as great, and where the bit transfer speed need not be as high. While a hardwire connection is illustrated, pull up my notes on this. Excuse me. And where the bit transfer speed need not be as high, while a hardwire connection is illustrated, other embodiments of wireless or other type of connection can be employed instead. So it seems that in itself, the 214 is opening the door for various types of serial links to be contemplated for facilitating the communication. And that can be found. Excuse me, the portion I decided was column 9, lines 12 through 16. Similarly, Copeland teaches all data goes through the connector and out through the serial interface. These serial port connectors, I think Copeland describes as an RS-232 type interface, but as shown in slide 45, all data, including the flow control data, is transmitted over the connector across the link. The link, as described in the 214, while possibly being these 2 axial lines, in fact, the 2 axial lines were cited in dependent claim 5 as an open-ended claim term. Therefore, claim 1 through claim differentiation must therefore include more. However, the 214 is not dispositive on saying that the serial link can be only these 2 simplex links within the cable.
You just used the word simplex, these 2 simplex links. What does the word simplex mean?
The understanding would be there to provide duplex communication, there are 2 simplex lines. So for devices that are both sending and transmitting, it would seem that 2 simplex links would have 1 line that provides data to the other device and 1 line that receives data from that device.
Right, so you just described sending data over a simplex link. Is the RS-232 connector actually a simplex link or a duplex link, and does that inform whether it is a serial link or not?
RS-232 is a duplex link.
So it's a duplex link, not a
But it includes simplex links within it. So the link described in the 214 is a duplex link. It is, as they show in their 1 embodiment of their connector, it contains 2 simplex links. I think shown as 2 twisted pair. RS-232 similarly includes simplex links as well as other control signals, but it's all transmitted over the serial link. So there's a serial communicate in RS-232, there's a serial link between device A and device B to facilitate serial communication between those devices. Similarly, in the 214 patent, there is a serial link that includes 2 simplex links as well as other potential signals on their cable that go between A and B.
Thank you.
Touching briefly on the Copeland-Dobson combination. As we return to slide 40, Copeland teaches generating a flow control signal, response to the amount of data being stored, equaling or exceeding the fill amount. This does not particularly seem to be an issue. In their reply, or excuse me, the patent owner response, as noted in slide 42, petitioner appears to map Dobson's IRQ signal to the flow control signal and states that is not transmitted through the serial link. Petitioner only mentioned the IRQ signal with respect to Dobson in its petition to show that Dobson, a complementary patent to Copeland, indeed operated using flow control. However, Copeland was expressly used to teach the element of transmitting the flow control to the second device.
So you're not disputing that Dobson's flow control signal is sent not over a serial link, correct?
That's correct, and we never attempted to assert that it did.
And why is Dobson different? So I'm looking at figure of Dobson that has two links in it, which is, just a minute, unless you know the figure I'm talking about. Yeah, it's figure 4 of Dobson. And you see there to the top left, we have 136, item number 136, and item number 8. It's my understanding that item number 136 is that flow control signal, and 136 is the data, and 8 is the flow control signal going over a non-serial link. Why is that not exactly? You're not disputing that Dobson doesn't have its flow control signal going over a serial link. Why is Dobson's disclosure any different than Vangmert's, which has the same sort of two lines, but perhaps in one cable? Is it just because Dobson doesn't disclose it as one cable?
Dobson operates a little differently. Dobson's more directed to sending the flow control signal back to the host device, is where it describes most of its flow control. So it's connected to device A, and instead of as the host, right? So it's getting this parallel data from a host device, say a computer or a modem. It's then doing the processing to send the data out over a serial communication link. Its flow control, the IRQ signal in particular, is used to tell the host device that, hey, we need to stop and don't transmit anymore. That's why, while it does look to perform flow control, it doesn't do it in the same way that Copeland does. Copeland is responsible for communicating with the other device, the remote node, to say, hey, you're no longer allowed to send data.
I see. So it's over a serial link, but not the serial link, something like that. That makes sense. Not
Yes.
over the same serial link that we've been talking about the entire time.
Correct. The Dobson would be different than that.
Thank you. That's helpful.
These
So
are
if
all.
we could go back to a definition of a serial link here and which wires that serial link meets. Is it your position? I know there's no claim construction briefing on this, but is it your position that any cable that carries serial data, no matter how many other signals it also carries, as long as the data part is a serial data cable, that is a serial link? Would that be roughly your construction?
Yes, Your Honor. It would. I believe a person having ordinary skill in the art would understand that, particularly with reference to RS-232, which is maybe the better reference with respect to the 214, is that it's a point-to-point communication link between device A and device B, and it is a serial communication link between device A and device B.
Does that standard, the RS-232, does that ever call I know it calls the interface a serial interface. Does it ever call the link a serial link? I'm assuming you would have pointed it out if it did, but if I've missed that, I would like to know.
I don't believe that I will admit that if it is in the standard, I've not read the standard in detail as to how it may refer to it, but we do know that in the Copeland reference, it refers to RS-232 being a serial interface between the devices, I believe.
It's certainly called a serial interface.
Yes.
It's just the question of whether that same standard uses the term link instead of interface at any point. I understand that Copeland doesn't show the sort of line, but I was just curious if it referred to that line anywhere in anywhere in any really of the exhibits that you have sent, or have submitted rather.
No, unfortunately, Copeland tends to end at that point, but again, it does discuss that it is a connector, an RS-232 type link, or excuse me, connection is made between the two devices. One having skill in the art would understand that it communicates serial data over a single wire, and would therefore be a serial link, at least from a plain and ordinary meaning standpoint. I would like to go back briefly to the arguments made by Dr. Grimsrud. Just a moment to get my devices up to the right claims, or right slides. And particularly, the arguments made in slides 10 through 18. But these positions stand unrebutted by patent owner other than by attorney argument. Dr. Grimsrud was never deposed in this matter, and no expert testimony was proffered, nor was any leave taken or asked for to submit additional evidence. Further, with respect to, slides 20 through 25, so effectively with the flow control signal generation argument, you'd like to point out that the patent owner tends to say that this has to do with reaching the limits. Again, this seems to be new claim construction that was presented for the first time in the SIR reply. Finally, with respect to the combination of Vangemert and Copeland, turning to slide 29, it's petitioners' belief that, and cited position, that Vangemert teaches everything in Claim 1 other than potentially the connector, which is clearly taught by Copeland. However, we did offer a potential combination or substitution for one flow control signal protocol, such as the one in Copeland, with Vangemert. Patent owner, again, we're referring to slide 29, it further said that there was no motivation to combine these two different flow controls. I'd first like to this is in contrast to the testimony provided by Dr. Kalyanides. Let me find my proper sites here. Dr. Kalyanides in his exhibit, as well as in the petition, excuse me one moment. Excuse me, Your Honor. Effectively, in the petition, we argue both the substitution and the combination. Patent owner argued over the combination, saying that it would not be proper to use multiple types of flow control signals in one system. We'd like to point the court to Patent Owners Exhibit 2008, which is an exhibit relating to Network World, which is discussing the group's determination of flow control mechanisms within a new asynchronous transfer mode. In it, and I quote, Ken Brinkoff, a spokesman for the Flow Control Consortium, said devices could be built that support both flow control schemes and long-term the market would then decide. So it is known to potentially put two different flow control schemes in one single system. Additionally, petitioner put forth that Copeland could be substituted for Vangamert. The flow control could be substituted, and the substitution was not rebutted by patent owner, only the combination thereof.
If we could just talk a little bit about, I saw two combinations in your petition. One is Vangamert's, I'm going to call it, Copeland's, I'm going to call it a hardware control. You understand what I mean when I say hardware control? It's not in the data word itself, like in Vangamert.
Yes, sir.
So Copeland's hardware control, flow control, and Vangamert's software control. I understood one of your combinations to be replacing Vangamert's software control with Copeland's hardware control. And one of your combinations to be adding them together, where you could do flow control with both software and hardware. Is there anything I'm missing about your combination where there's some sort of in-between that you were suggesting? And if so, is that in your papers? Or is it just a wholesale adding of all the pieces of Copeland that it would take to include that hardware control? In other words, how much of Copeland are you bringing over into Vangamert in your combination?
Well, I think in the first level, the petition talks about we could bring in, say perhaps with the generating, right? It would be potential to not require a hardware flow control of Copeland wholesale. One could take these.
Let me cut to the chase. Did you suggest a combination in which you used just the concept of exceeding a threshold in Copeland, but do that in Vangamert's software control? And if so, where is that in your petition?
I will save that for rebuttal, Your Honor.
Fair enough. So my question is clear?
Yes, Your Honor. Do your honors have any additional questions?
We don't. If you'd like to reserve the remainder of your time, we'll go ahead and give you 20 minutes on rebuttal. I think we have a number of things to address, so that might be helpful.
Yes, thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you. Mr. Thies, correct?
Yes.
Mr. Thies, whenever you're ready, how much time would you like to
I'd
reserve?
like to reserve 15 minutes, Your Honor.
Could you say again, please?
15, please.
45.
Actually, Your Honor, can I have 1 minute to step outside and get a drink of water?
Take your time. We'll take a 5-minute recess. We'll go off the record. Thanks. everybody ready to go back on the record? Looks like we may be frozen on the screen. Who's ready? Wait for Judge Ahmed.
Okay, reversed.
Looks like we have everybody back. Judge Ahmed, can you hear me? Judge McShane?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you.
There it is. All right, with that, we'll go back on the record. We are back on the record. Mr. Thies, you have 45 minutes on the clock whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Your Honor. I'd like to first start with what the petition alleged with regard to element K. I'm referring to slide 2. As Your Honor addressed when you asked the question of petitioner, whether it was clear that the Vangamort reference doesn't meet this limitation. And we agree, Your Honor, that it's clear that, and everyone agrees, that the way Vangamort works is before anyone can transmit, there has to be a buffer credit control word allocated. Your Honor asked petitioner's counsel about where in the reference does it teach anything that happens when the value is equal. I'm going to direct you to slide 21 of petitioner's slide deck. Petitioner's counsel read from their second bullet points, and I'll read it again. The buffer credit manager 418 generates a credit upon determining that the committed buffer space fill amount is less than the available capacity by at least the size of one data frame. The credit is then packaged into a buffer credit control word by the transmit controller, emphasizing the word less.
But that's petitioner's characterization of it, and their point is, look, you didn't bring this point up until your SIR reply, so we never had a shot. So I'm less curious about petitioner's characterization of it, rather Vangamert's characterization of it. What happens when they are at precisely that equal point?
Well, Your Honor, I think petitioner's slide 22 is demonstrative of petitioner's misapprehension of what is actually taught in Vangamort. You'll see on the right figure, which was not included in any of the papers, you'll see a circumstance that is physically impossible in Vangamort. Vangamort, as I said, you can only transmit when the buffer control manager has allocated you a buffer credit control word. Therefore, buffer overflow is not possible. In Vangamort, you cannot have the figure shown in blue and red on the right-hand side of the figure. You cannot have a credit control word that is issued that will cause the buffer to overflow, because credits are only issued when there is available buffer space for that frame. And we discussed that extensively in our patent owner response. Specifically, where I think the dispute is, and I think it's really critical, is the actual claim language, as you can see on slide 2 of ours. The claim says the module is operable to generate a flow control signal in response to the amount of data stored in the first buffer equaling or exceeding the fill amount. That's what the claim says. Now, if we look at what petitioner mapped in element K, it says the bit credit control signal is generated when available buffer space is sufficient, equal to the fill amount to accept the data word to transmit. Emphasis, and the emphasis is highlighted there. Specifically, there is no attempt by petitioner to capture the in response to or anything related to what was shown in slide 22 or 23, as we just discussed. Specifically, as it relates to the in response to, the first time that the in response to appears is in petitioner's reply, moving to slide 3. And as highlighted in the motion to strike, expert explained allegedly the in response to language. But as we highlighted out in our reply to the motion to strike, it is not our job to go through and play archaeologists through the record. The PTAB's rules are very clear on incorporation. If it's not in the paper, it's not being argued. The petition did not argue the in response to language, therefore we didn't respond to it, since it was so clear on its face that Copeland teaches a situation whereby it is not possible for the claim limitation to be met.
I think you mean Bangamer.
I'm sorry, Bangamer, I misspoke. Thank you. And that issue of when and what is the triggering event is particularly critical, as we highlight on slide 5. Because as your honors noted in your questioning, is that in Vandermort, control words are made available, credit control words are made available when there is space. There is no teaching in Vandermort of any sort of control signal or anything that is sent or discussed or any sort of control concept that is sent when it's equal to or exceeding, which is the exact claim language. So our position is that petitioner never met their burden of showing how this element was met. We explain how the technology fundamentally cannot meet the claim limitation. And therefore, there was not any sort of waiver that was given. We explained how the technology could not meet the claim limitation. Petitioner did not argue it met the claim limitation. And we responded to the in response to language that was added by petitioner in their reply, and we addressed it in the SIR reply pursuant to the rules. I would then like to move to the tachyon reference and note, as shown on slide 6, that tachyon is not one of the grounds for our proceeding today. It's not proposed at the time of the petition.
But again, counsel, if we could focus on the dispute, no one's going to argue that it was in the grounds, and no one's going to argue that they can't bring it in as an additional reference. The entire question is whether tachyon is used to describe what Vandermert's doing, not what tachyon describes in and of itself. So if we could stick to that issue rather than assume we agree with you that tachyon can't come in as an independent reference without Vandermert's teaching. Why is it, I assume you disagree with your opposing counsel's characterization that tachyon is describing what Vandermert's doing, and if you could point us to something in tachyon that says, this is one way to do it, but there are other ways to do it, for example, that would be helpful, because your opposing counsel has said, no, this is a standard, and this is a standard that Vandermert applies. So that would be helpful, that discussion.
Yes, Your Honor. So I will provide you the exact citations in my rebuttal period of time, but to talk about where the tachyon reference comes from, it is from a journal from HP that was discussing implementations of fiber channel. The tachyon reference is specifically a board, a module that can support fiber channel. It is not describing the standard. It is one particular vendor's, one particular inventor, one particular guy's way that he was proposing to implement fiber channel.
And I understand your characterization that if you could just point us, in rebuttal is fine, if you could point us to that text, that would be helpful.
Absolutely, Your Honor. And specifically, when we go into the details of what tachyon is talking about as it relates to the ACK signal, we notice that we talk about Vandermort, we're talking about the transmitter getting permission before they transmit the information. Well, Your Honor, as we explained in the SIR reply, an ACK is afterwards. It's a confirmation that something was said. Reading exactly from our brief, an ACK is an acknowledgement that is sent after a previous transmission was received that confirms receipt. So in one case, you have something that's happening before, which is what is taught in Vandermort. And then you have this tachyon reference that's talking about ACKs that are sent afterwards. These are just two fundamentally different sets of control. And I think the prosecution history is very helpful in this regard. The base reference that was citing Stokowski, I apologize for the mispronunciation of the inventor's name, used an acknowledgement system that was used ACKs that are very similar to what is being described in tachyon. And the examiner said, no, that doesn't teach what is going on here because our invention is different.
But I don't understand why post sort of the different authorization times would affect whether the control word hit. We're talking about whether that control word hits that buffer, right? Why does it matter that one is a pre-authorization and one is a sort of overflow alarm? Why does that difference matter to whether the control word would hit that buffer? Why is that distinction important?
Well, Your Honor, as it goes into petitioner's hypothetical of the deadlock, which isn't discussed anywhere, it's a consideration that one would have in such a system as it relates to deadlock, as it relates to the acknowledgements, because the acknowledgement would be left open if it couldn't transmit. But again, deadlock isn't mentioned anywhere in Vangamort. It's not mentioned anywhere in any of the cited papers. But the differences in the architectures are important here, Your Honor. We have what Vangamort actually says, and Vangamort's improvement in using these buffer credit control words to control who can talk when. And then we have additional references that are not in the record that are talking about implementations that offer additional solutions to controlling who can talk when. They're just different.
If we could turn to that disclosure in column 4, line 14 through 16 of Vangamort.
Yes, just give me 1 second to advance that slide on
Sure.
that. Yes, just give me 1 second. Oh, where'd it go? Hang on for 1 second, Your Honor.
Please.
Oh, there we go. It is on slide 9. I apologize. Yes.
So column 4, line 13 says the buffer credit control manager is enabled. The transmit controller begins transmitting buffer credit control words in response to a credit signal from the buffer credit manager. That describes an enabling followed by a transmitting. Doesn't say anything in between about sending it down to a buffer. I understand your point that there's no inherent disclosure. I understand petitioner's position to be this is an express disclosure. It says step A and step B, and it would be silly to impose a illogical step in between. My question for you is why is this disclosure at column 4, lines 13 through 16 not an affirmative disclosure of sending the control word out the transmission line without hitting that buffer?
Because every other teaching in the Vangamort reference teaches that the control words are sent via the buffer.
But those are different control words. Those are data control words. Isn't that correct?
I am unaware of any teaching in Vangamort that makes a distinction between them. I think, if anything, it's a matter of sloppy patent drafting. The only control words that are taught on how they're transmitted are regarded to being retrieved from buffer 410.
So it's your understanding that that disclosure that you pointed to in your briefs, which is column 3, line 49, when it says a transmit controller receives control words and data frames from transmit buffer and forwards them to encoder, that means credit control words, not data control words?
We're of the position, and we believe Vangamort does not make a distinction between the two. There's not a teaching in Vangamort that says that we're going to handle data control words one way, buffer credit control words another way.
Is there any recognition in Vangamort of those two things existing at all? In other words, I know Vangamort uses the word credit control words. Does it ever use any other kind of control words, or the only kind of control words, generic control words and credit control words?
I would have to check the record, Your Honor, but my recollection is that control words only appear, and buffer credit control words are the only ones that are used, but I would have to confirm the record.
And your position would be those are synonyms, is that correct?
Yes, Your Honor. And further, we would highlight that it's petitioner's burden to lay out that they are different. It is not our burden to prove that they are the same, because it is petitioner's burden, particularly as highlighted as we see on the slide, on slide 10, if the trier effect of the issue is left uncertain, the party with the burden loses. And that is the case here. The petitioner has the burden of showing that they're different, because the patent shows clearly the control words are sent via the buffer 410, as there's an express control there.
So your position would be that column 4 is describing part of the transmission, but not all of it. Is that correct?
I think column 4 is providing the general architecture and is not going into the level of granularity about how the machinations and the blocking and the tackling of the transmission work. In most communication systems prior to transmission, there's going to be some sort of a buffer. That's entirely what the buffer credit control words are for, is recognizing this fact that often in communication systems, there needs to be a holding point. And as we highlight on slide 11, petitioner has not made any effort to show that Vandermort teaches that they're different. And again, it is petitioner's burden, it is not ours. So petitioners has attempted to fill the gaps in Vandermort through their expert testimony alone, specifically as it relates to the existence of a FIFO buffer. There is nothing in Vandermort that says that any of the buffers are FIFO. Expert predicates their conclusions on the fact that the buffers are FIFO. As we discussed in our briefing, there's lots of other types of buffers that could potentially be implemented, addressable buffers, priority-based buffers that could have been implemented. However, Vandermort is silent as to this issue. As the Fed Circuit has pointed out, experts' conclusory statements and unspecific expert testimony do not qualify as substantial evidence that can support the board's conclusion regarding obviousness. So all the leaps that are predicated on Vandermort being FIFO are not supported by anything other than petitioner's expert's testimony. Specifically looking at slide 8 of petitioner's, from petitioner's slide deck. Their expert, I'm sorry, I'm not going to mispronounce his name, testified that a Bacito would understand that the buffer credit control word in Vandermort is not passed through the transmit buffer. There's no support for that. And that was exactly the case in Xerox v. Bytemark. The precedential, the decision of the PTAB that was marked precedential by Director Vidal. Specifically, that holds that the cited declaration testimony is conclusory and unsupported and therefore is entitled to little weight. We have the expert going on blind faith that a Posito would understand that the credit control word of Vandermort is not passed through the transmit buffer. There is nothing in Vandermort, there's nothing in the intrinsic record, there's nothing in the extrinsic record that holds for that proposition. The only thing we have is unsubstantiated expert testimony.
Counsel, what about the reason that he gives? He gives a good reason for it, right? That you want to reduce data transmission latency, and it's in line with Vandermort's goals. Why is that not enough?
Oh, Your Honor, because there's a large number of ways that you can avoid the data latency. As we're highlighting on slide 14, quoting the SIR reply at page 15, it could be implemented in an addressable buffer, a random access memory, a priority queue, and the problems that their expert is highlighting only happen if you have a very, very large FIFO buffer. Again, these are not addressed in the record. We're not standing here trying to redesign Vandermort as not peer persons of ordinary skill in the art at the time of this IPR. The petition is supposed to stand on its own and lay out these issues.
Okay.
And if we look at, jumping to our next slide, let me just reiterate, there's nothing in Vandermort that says that it is inherently FIFO. Vandermort is entirely silent as to the issue. Moving to the proposed combination with Copeland, I would just like to note that in the reply, petitioner cites to the MPEP section for IDS as being relevant to whether or not references are cumulative. I'm not sure of the placement here, but again, going back to why the patent was allowed, the argumentation that the patent, the applicant, ultimately the patent owner, got this case allowed, and the examiner had rejected based on James, which uses a flow control mechanism comprising level indicators for the input buffers for indicating the amount of data stored in a buffer, and a flow control device for monitoring the level indicators to determine if the amount of data in the input buffer crosses the first threshold. Exactly what Copeland does. Petitioner stood before you and discussed that they're only relying upon Copeland for the teaching of a connector. We don't think this is entirely fair. If you look at the statements made by the applicants in the prior office action prior to the notice of allowance, the applicant made roughly 40 pages of argumentation. One argument said a connector is not inherently part of a serial link. We are all in agreement, as shown by the RS-232 standard, that RS-232 connectors could be used with serial connectors. They're almost synonymous. Clearly, the examiner allowed the case for something other than the proposition that serial ports have serial connectors. So we get into the real motivation to combine of Vangemort and Copeland. So Vangemort teaches a system by which you cannot possibly have a buffer overflow, because the only time that you can transmit is if you have permission. So if there's space below the threshold, you can get a buffer credit control word. And then you have Copeland, which teaches that you set a signal, the RTS signal, when you have exceeded a threshold. Combining these two would actually have the reverse effect of decreasing the latency, which Your Honor had asked me about, by putting them together, because now we have to deal with two separate systems.
Okay, assume you're right that gluing the two systems together and doing both software control through Vangemert's system and a hardware control more proactively through Copeland's system is a problem. That doesn't do anything to using Copeland's control method in Vangemert. Why is that a problem? Does Vangemert somehow teach away from using hardware control? What's incompatible about Copeland's control in Vangemert, assuming we're not also using Vangemert's control, which petitioner was pretty explicit about that is one of two combinations that they're proposing?
Yes, Your Honor. To first address the hardware versus software issue, the physical hardware type control with the RTS and the CTS signals that are taught are physically incompatible with fiber channel. Once we go into in our PLR, we go into a bit of briefing as to the voltage levels and things of that nature, where in RS-232 it specifically levels. But to address your specific question of why can't we take this concept of using the buffer overflow signal that's set in Copeland, why can't we bolt that into the buffer credit control system that is taught in Vangemort? And Your Honor, that is because it would completely defeat the entire purpose of Vangemort, which was the buffer credit control words. It would be a complete impermissible redesign to take a system that is designed to increase the efficiency of the transmission system by prohibiting buffer overflows, to now take in a completely different system that only operates when you have an overflow. It just would be a complete and impermissible redesign. And effectively what would happen if you bodily combine the two, as is proposed in the petition, is that you would end up in a circumstance where you potentially could have a red signal and a green signal, both saying go and stop, where there's a buffer credit control where that was allocated, but you're over the 40% that is taught in Copeland. So what do you do? So with moving to the proposed combination with Dobson, Your Honor, you talked with petitioner's counsel quite a bit about this figure. We had originally looked at the IRQ because we were under the impression that we now are in agreement that the flow control signal that is taught in Dobson does not leave the board.
And we're on slide 19.
Slide 19, yes, Your Honor. I apologize. Slide 19, we're in agreement now that the flow control signal taught in Dobson does not leave. That's why we looked at the IRQ, because it physically leaves the device. Because specifically, the patent requires that the data go over the serial link, as well as the flow control signal through the serial link and the connector. But now, as we understand it, this is an explanation of how RS-232 works specifically. Your Honor had asked questions about what is taught related to the hardware handshaking versus the data signal. We would like to further explain, as explained in the patent itself, is that a duplex connection signal is formed by two simplexes connected to each other. Specifically in RS-232, which is called out, it's the transmit and the receive lines. Those are the only two wires where data is transmitted.
Counsel, this is Judge McShane. Sorry to interrupt. Are you on slide 20? Are you on slide 20 now?
Yes, I'm on slide 20 now. Yes, Your Honor. Specifically in Copeland, it discusses the clear to send and the ready to send signal. So the request to send. So request to send is pin 7 in the DB9. Clear to send is pin 8 in the DB9, and it corresponds to similar channels in the DB25.
But counsel, this connector, this device connector, is called a serial device interface, right? It's called a serial interface, is it not?
Yeah. Yes, Your Honor.
Doesn't that show that a serial interface contemplates that we're sending serial data, even if it has other pins?
Well, no, Your Honor. I believe that the claim makes it quite clear that there's a distinction between the serial connector and the serial link.
I think you do have claims that make that clear. I'm just not sure they're challenged here, and I'd like to ask you about that. If Claim 10 and Claim 18 say explicitly what you want it to say, which is that you're going to send the data flow control signal over the same line, over the data line. If you could give me a little background, I assume there's a parallel litigation, is that true?
Yes, Your Honor.
Were claims 10 and 18 at issue in that case?
I don't know off the top of my head, Your Honor.
So you don't know whether 10 or 18 are asserted?
They're separate litigation counsel.
Fair enough. So is it the fact that claims 10 and 18 claim explicitly what you are sort of articulating you want claim 1 to be? Isn't that evidence that claim 1 is broader by the sort of doctrine of claim differentiation? And I know we don't have a claim construction dispute here. Nonetheless, that strikes me as informative. Can you respond to that?
Yes, Your Honor. And I think we really need to drill into that last where-in clause. Is it says transmit the flow control signal through the serial link and the connector. Under Your Honor's proposed construction, we'd be reading the connector out. There would be no reason for the connector to be there. That word would have no meaning.
I understand there needs to be a connector and a link. The question is whether that link can include multiple lines.
Yes, Your Honor.
Is it your position that it stops being a serial link when it controls multiple lines, or is it no, that connector has a serial line and parallel lines as well?
Yeah, the latter, Your Honor, is that in the RS-232 standard, there are signals and there are data. And Copeland itself makes that distinction.
It just strikes me, when I was talking about the connector, what I was saying is that in the prior art seems to refer to some things as serial things that include parallel elements. So my point is not that it doesn't have to pass through this connector, but just that the prior art refers to serial things as serial things carry serial data and have parallel elements. Now, if I'm wrong about that the prior art calls it something different, I would like to know. But if not, if you could respond to that.
Yes, Your Honor. I would like to direct you to column 3 of Copeland. Column 3, roughly lines 13.
Just a second.
Yep.
Okay.
The present invention, while providing for automatic flow control, also allows the host computer to directly deassert the DTR and or RTS signals and signal the remote transmitter to stop sending. Then going to the end of that paragraph, at the end of that section, starting on line 29, it is a further object of the present invention to provide for automatic flow control while allowing the host computer to signal the remote transmitter to stop sending data. So there is a distinction that Copeland is saying between the signals, which are sent on the RTS and CTS line, which is consistent with the terms being used in the standard, and the data that is sent over the RTX and TXT lines, which is the receive and transmit, those two simplex links that form the duplex link where the data is sent.
disagree with my characterization of dependent claim 10 as explicitly claiming control signal in the data line?
No, Your Honor.
Okay. And you would agree that claim 1 does not make that same explicit distinction?
That's correct, Your Honor. It is making it explicit as to where the data is being sent. Yes, Your Honor.
So am I correct that under your proposed, we'll call it construction, or the way you're reading the claims, claim 1 and claim 10 would have the same scope and there would be no difference? Is that true?
I would like to take a moment to address that on the rebuttal portion, but I think there's a subtle nuance that I'm unable to explain to you. That's clear in my mind. I need a couple minutes to formulate my response to that.
That's fine. Thank you.
So without any other questions, Your Honor, I'm willing to answer any questions you have.
Give us just a minute,
Yep.
if you would, please. Now, if we could talk a little bit about the combination.
Mhm.
I asked opposing counsel, what's wrong, or did you propose a combination in which you are using Copeland's trigger mechanism with Vangermert's software configuration? In other words, instead of giving tokens ahead of time to say there's room, to use a overflow case, but in data, not in a separate line. What's wrong with that combination?
Oh, we don't believe it's argued and briefed.
Is that the only thing that you're arguing is missing? You would say, if that were argued in the brief, we would concede our case, but it's not.
Absolutely not, Your Honor.
Okay, if so, what's wrong with it? I obviously am not asking you to concede your case, but if you would articulate for me substantive problems with that argument other than just they didn't make it.
Well, Your Honor, we have the issue of how that would work in Fiber Channel. Fiber Channel, which is what Vanguard is entirely about, is how would you adapt Fiber Channel that needs this control governor saying who can transmit when? How could you adapt that to handle the situation where it's a willy-nilly, there is no control, and you're looking for someone to assert and deassert? Particularly as it relates to RS-232, which is the concept that is talked about in Copeland. We're talking point-to-point, one-to-one. Fiber Channel is entirely predicated on the idea of having a ring network or there's other architectures where there's one-to-many type communication.
Vangermert has a fiber channel, correct?
Yes.
And that's a one-to-many configuration? Can you just articulate what that means?
Meaning that there's a shared channel among multiple things, printers, storage devices, where in RS-232, it is a single DTE to DCE device, two devices connected over a wire, the transmit and receiver flipped on each other so that the transmit on one is the receive on the other. So it's a one-to-one type communication. That works, and you can use these analog switching mechanisms because you know who's asserting and who's deasserting because you're only connected to one thing. When you go into a more complicated architecture like what's taught in Fiber Channel, you have the circumstance where I can assert I can say stop because my buffer is full, but your buffer is fine. I don't know who's transmitting to whom. You need a more complicated control mechanism, which is just more than just a matter of swapping one in and swapping the other one out.
Thank you. With that, I don't have any further questions. Let me check in with the rest of the panel. Any further questions at this point? Great. We will put an extra 13.
No questions, thank you.
Thank you.
Put an extra 13 minutes on the clock, so you'll have, you said 15. Petitioner, whenever you're ready, we're going to put 20 minutes on the clock. Give us just a minute.
Could I have a mentoring moment? Couple minutes?
You want some time off the record?
Yes.
Yes, we'll take 2 minutes off the record. Go ahead.
Council, do you need more time? If it's more okay with it, we understand it.
If you need more time than that, that's fine.
Okay.
If you need more time outside, why don't you, we'll take a 5-minute break and we'll be back on the record.
Thank you very much. comments before we go back on, if I might? Thank you for letting Sam have this experience.
You bet. We're happy to have it. We have the program for a reason. Give us just a minute if you would, please. Okay, with that, let's go back on the record. Mr. Brooks, we put 20 minutes on the clock. There's no hurry. Begin whenever you're ready. Okay.
Thank you. So to discuss some of the questions that came up from the previous presentation. One, I believe you had asked whether tachyon refers to being an implementation of the fiber channel standard. Page 1 of the article specifically recites.
Could you give me a reference to
Yes.
the article? What exhibit number is it, please?
That is tachyon is exhibit
1014, maybe?
yes 1014.
Thank you.
Apologize, it's hard to switch back and forth here. And this would be actually page 97 of the exhibit, page 1 of the article. And in the heading, it is stated that the tachyon chip implements the FC1 and FC2 layers of the 5-layer fiber channel standard, which I think shows that fiber channel is instructive on how fiber channel, or excuse me, tachyon is instructive on how the fiber channel protocol operates. Further, Mr. Lee, paragraph 99 of exhibit 2002, appears to concede this point, stating that fiber channel is indeed a standard. The other question outstanding was whether the petition taught substitution as well as combination of Copeland with Vangemert. And this is recited in the petition in pages 29 and 30, saying that it could be combined or the flow control mechanism of Copeland could be substituted.
Right, and I would like to hit on that second point a little bit. The question is, in that second, that substitution, how much of Copeland are you bringing into Vangemert? My question makes sense?
Yes, Your Honor. And I believe,
Is it just the triggering mechanism, or is it the entire mechanism whereby you're sending a hardware signal instead of a software signal?
it would be the latter. We'd say that it substitutes Copeland's flow control signal for the Vangemert's bit credit signal. simply. We're not revising hardware. It'd be the operation of how the flow control signal of Copeland is generated versus the one of Vandermeert. I'd like to address several other points. Patent owner counsel stated that the deadlock condition was not in any of the papers. However, it was presented in the reply, pages 11 to 12. Not that specific figure that's shown in slide 13, but the text to the left describing the example that is simply illustrated by the figure. Further, with respect to the serial link again, we'd like to point out that the 214 patent upon which this particular argument is said to found support never in fact mentions a serial link. It mentions a link and cables, but never specifically recites a serial link. Thus, the serial link appears in the 454 patent, which was filed some 14 years after the filing of the 214 patent and by its, at that time, third owner.
Could you just repeat that entire point again for me, please, counsel?
Yes, Your Honor. The 214 patent is what is used by patent owner to attempt to define the serial link. However, the 214 patent does not mention a serial link. It mentions a link and it mentions a cable, but does not specifically recite a serial link therein.
Only the later patent, which is the patent at issue in this case.
Correct.
Fair enough, thank you.
Returning back to the beginning, or close to the beginning, at slide 7, we previously discussed the importance of begins transmitting. I'd like to follow that up with, it should be noted that it says begins transmitting, not begins building, begins storing, or begins doing any other operation, simply begins transmitting these buffer credit control words in response to a credit signal from the buffer credit manager. And, one moment please. The subsequent sentence in column 4 at lines 16 through 23 effectively says that at the beginning of the exchange, the received buffer is empty. Buffer credit manager is provided with a negotiated frame size and the received buffer capacity and is expected to generate and manage a number of buffer credits at least equal to the maximum receiver buffer capacity divided by the frame size with as little delay as possible. As discussed earlier with respect to Dr. Calianade's testimony and Dr. Grimsrud's testimony, putting this signal into the transmit buffer would incorporate delay into it being transmitted. Patent owner, in addressing a question related to, I believe in his discussion of a FIFO buffer, cites to other potential buffer types that were not laid out by patent owner's expert. However, these additional buffer types alleged by counsel are just that, counsel allegations. There is no evidence, no expert testimony that says that these other types of buffers would be possible in this type of system. This is attorney argument only. Further, neither Dr. Calianades nor Dr. Grimsrud were ever deposed to attempt to determine if other types of buffers may have been possible. Accordingly, I think there's little weight that should be afforded to these arguments. In another, returning to slides 22 and 23, patent owner in their briefs have made comments that it would make no sense to combine Copeland and Vandermeert, as Vandermeert makes overflow impossible. However, I think the correct assertion is that the purpose of flow control is to make overflow impossible. Copeland, by virtue of sending or denying more transmissions to occur when the buffer's at 40% would prevent overflow in that system. Similarly, Vanguard with its credit system does the same. With respect to the argument that the conditions seen here would never exist, I think that mischaracterizes the explanation of how this works. Yes, the fill amount has space above it. You know, it's the maximum data size. But again, Vanguard is an arbitrated loop. There may be data. It will not transmit that buffer credit control signal if there's not that much space. So there must be situations where that space is occupied by a data frame. If not, the buffer credit control signal would never not be transmitted. Further, in the combination, Patent Owners Council cited Copeland's teaching that it needed 40%, that the threshold was 40%, and it would make no sense and not thereby increase the or decrease the latency using Copeland. However, 40% is just an example used in Copeland, not the only value which could be set for the predetermined level. Again, just to walk through the generation of the buffer credit control word, I point to slide 4, which shows the full system annotated of Vanguard. To the left is the transceiver portion of the circuit or the system. To the right is the previous portion having to do with decoding, encoding of data, the building of the blocks. Here, on the receive channel at the top of figure 3, a signal is received by the receiver. It is converted to a parallel signal that is sent to the decoder and then to the receive controller. In that data can be a request to transmit data, as noted in column 4, lines 11 through 16. It's received by the receive controller, which communicates to the buffer credit manager. The buffer credit manager then determines whether there's available space, transmits the control signal to the transmit controller, which then transmits the buffer credit control word to the encoder, from the encoder to the transceiver, where it is converted into a serial data frame, and then transmitted via the transmitter. To address one other point presented by Patent Owners Council, the argument with respect to the cumulative art argument, he noted that the section cited to by, I'm just going to find the right slide here. The section cited to, I'm at slide 35, the MP EP 60904A as being directed to an IDS. It's true that is the section. However, that portion of the MPEP cites to Semiconductor Energy Laboratory Company versus Samsung Electronics, a Federal Circuit case from 2000, finding that a reference was not cumulative since it contained a more complete combination of the claimed elements than any other reference before the examiner. As presented in petitioner's reply at page 20, at 22, Vanguard does contain a more complete combination of the claimed elements than any other reference before the examiner. As noted in our briefs, both in the petition and the reply, Vanguard effectively teaches every element of claim 1 other than the claimed connector. And then finally, to touch on the difference between buffer credit control words and credit control signals. Excuse me, if I'm the slide that I'm looking for. In fact, let me point to actually petitioners, or excuse me, patent owners, slide 9. See the claim language in column 3 of 1005, the Vangemer reference. When it's discussing transmitting these data frames and the control words associated with that, I think it's important to read that language in detail. The transmit controller 416 creates or updates exchange information in the exchange tables in response to commands and data from the node's I/O bus. So again, not to jump back and forth too much, but it is receiving data from the I/O bus. So the right-hand side of figure 4, the annotated figure here on slide 4, which is where the data is indeed coming from the host device. In response to commands and data from that bus, the transmit controller generates control words and data frames. I think the "and" is important in the transmit buffer and forwards them to a coder. It's clear that this is all done as part of the data transmitting process. If we look above patent owner's highlights there, it says if the node is transmitting or receiving data, i.e. participating in an exchange of data. This is clearly a different process than the flow control mechanisms cited in column 4, which state that before the data transfer can occur, the credit control word is sent in response to the credit signal. With that, do your honors have any additional questions?
Anything additional from the panel? Thank you, counsel.
No, no questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Patent owner will put 28 minutes on the clock. And you may begin when you're ready.
Thank you. Thank you, Your Honor. I again apologize for getting over a cold. My magical powers aren't working. There we go. Your Honor, one of the questions you had asked was regarding the usage of the word control words versus buffer credit control words in Vangemer. And we've read through the reference, and we think that column 3, starting at line 9, going to about line 13, really illustrates the fact that Vangemer does not make a distinction between buffer credit control words and control words generally. The passage reads, using control words, an initiating node first arbitrates to get control of the loop, then notifies a responding node of its desire to transmit data frames. So specifically here, we have a discussion of control words, not buffer credit control words specifically being used for gaining access to being able to transmit over that common channel amongst multiple devices that we discussed as being.
But the credit comparison hasn't even happened yet, has it?
It's discussing the mechanism by which control is obtained, how that individual is able to transmit the data.
Right. And it seems to me that this cuts against your point because it's talking about a control word to get control of the loop. And that's happening before there's been any comparison, any check to see if there's enough room yet. So aren't control words something different than credit control words?
I don't see it that way, Your Honor. The way the transmission in a buffer credit control system works is you have to request the buffer credit control word, the buffer credit control token, I think was the word that you used. So the process starts with requesting the token. Once you're given the token, you can then broadcast.
I think this point is a little bit more clear from the discussion or from the discussion in Vangemer of column 4, the paragraph we've been discussing at length that begins at line 11 that says, consequently, when receive controller receives a control word indicating that that a remote node wishes to transmit data, the buffer credit manager is enabled and the transmit controller begins transmitting buffer credit control words. That's what I'm talking about. Aren't buffer credit control words later in the system than these control words?
Yes, to that extent, Your Honor, there are other control words that are used. However, when it comes to the transmission and their utilization, there is no separate discussion that buffer credit control words are transmitted separately than control words, or the only discussion of how control words, be they buffer, be they non-buffer, is through the transmit buffer 410. And again, it's petitioner's burden to show that they are different because we have an express teaching that credit control words are sent through the buffer. It's their burden. You had asked me about tachyon, specifically as it relates to, is it an implementation? So I would direct the board to exhibit 1014, page 5, the end sentence I'll read from. The article on page 99 describes tachyon, which is HP's gigabit fiber channel chip. The article on page 94 presents a technical description of fiber channel. Patent owner cited to the technical description of fiber channel on page 94. Petitioner cites to a specific implementation of aspects of fiber channel on page 99, which is captured on page 99 of the article, which I believe is page 101 of the exhibits. Give me 1 second to get there. Reading from the first heading, the tachyon chip implements the FC1 and FC2 layers of the fiber layer channel standard. It doesn't implement the entire standard. It implements aspects of it in a particular way according to HP's interpretation and HP's chip. There's nothing in the fiber channel standard that requires this particular tachyon HP implementation. There's nothing in Vangamort that says it has to be tachyon's implementation. There is nothing to connect tachyon to Vangamort other than the fact that they both deal with a standard and they're different implementations and improvements on that standard.
Also, to go back to Judge Ahmed's question, assume we agree with you that tachyon isn't really describing Vangamort. What about Judge Ahmed's question, which is, although this wasn't asserted as a separate grounds, petitioner did assert a reason why you would not hit the second buffer. You contested that, said no, Vangamort does hit the second buffer. So petitioner came back to support its rationale for why it would have been known not to. They came back with a reference that you had submitted yourself that showed that it was known to transmit control signals without hitting a buffer. Is that, what's wrong with that logic? Or is it that the only thing that's wrong with it is they didn't present that clearly enough in the petition?
Well, I think there's an important distinction there, and I don't know if Your Honor deliberately misspoke or accidentally did. We submitted the article starting on page 94, which talks about the fiber channel standard and relied upon it for a teaching and discussion that the fiber channel standard existed.
Just fine, but the point is, this is certainly prior art. This article reflects what a person of skill in the art would have known at the time. The petitioner has said a person of skill in the art at the time, it was known to send a control signal without storing it in a buffer. You came back and said, no, that's not what's in Vangamort. And to support their assertion that a person of skill in the art would have known that, they brought forth a reference that in fact discloses that. What's wrong with that argument? Or is the only thing that's wrong with that argument is that it wasn't presented clearly enough in the petition?
Well, Your Honor, I think the real issue there is whether it's inherently there.
Now assume that petitioner and the panel agrees with you. It is not inherent in Vangamort, but it is still a question of whether one of skill in the art would have known to do it. Petitioner asserted that one of skill in the art would have known to do it, and you contested that assertion, and they have presented evidence that even if Vangamort doesn't teach that, one of skill in the art would have known to do it. One of skill in the art would have known to use this reference to clarify Vangamort for what to do. What's wrong with that?
There's two aspects that are wrong with that, Your Honor. First off, it's talking about an ACK buffer, which is not the buffer credit control buffer that we're talking about, or buffer credit control words that we're talking about in Vangamort. And the other aspect that we're not addressing is why would a person of ordinary skill in the art go for that particular implementation for a different control signal? We're talking about the ACKs, which is taught in tachyon, Why would they go for that where we've laid out alternatives that could have been laid out to Tachyon where it wouldn't have? That's what's taught in Tachyon regarding different buffer architectures. It seems to be inappropriate to stand here and try to redesign and put our patent as a blueprint based on possibilities of what a person of ordinary skill in the art could have made or perhaps done. We're guided by the petition here, and the petition doesn't lay those things out.
And assuming we disagree with you, is it a legal error for us to, what is the case law that says, well, we can't do that. We have to rely on the petition so much that if we were to rely on this additional article, that would be a legal error. Is that a legal error or just something we shouldn't do as a matter of fairness?
I think dynamic drinkware lays it out pretty clearly that it's the nature of the expedited nature of an IPR where everything has to be governed and grounded by the petition. And dynamic drinkware makes it very clear that if there is a time, if there is any level of doubt in the tribunal, that the patent owner wins because they do not have the burden here. And for us to sit here and speculate about what a person of ordinary skill in the art might have considered to perhaps re-engineer the reference devoid of what is actually in the petition, yes, is a legal error under dynamic drinkware.
Thank you.
I also wanted to address claims 8 and 10, which I believe Your Honor had asked me for. Was 8 and 10 correct?
18 and 10.
I'm sorry, 18 and 10. So I'd first like to address the language of claim 10.
Could you give us just a minute to pull it up?
Yep.
This is claim 10 of the challenge patent, correct?
Yes, the 454 patent.
Okay, go ahead.
So it recites additional elements. Specifically, when it comes to claim 10, I think the critical issue that I was struggling to explain to you as being the difference is the module is further operable to transmit the serialized data frames over the serial link. We have an introduction of this idea of a data frame that is not captured in claim 1.
But isn't the point of this data, the passage right before it that says the second serial data comprises serialized data frames, including serialized control bits? Isn't that the aspect that we're focusing on here, whether the flow control is software control or hardware control? Isn't it true that claim 10 explicitly says that it's software control? The point being that with the patent drafter wanted to claim software control, the patent drafter did so explicitly in claim 10.
No, Your Honor, I think what you're failing to appreciate is just because data goes over the data channel, it does not need to be in the data frame. You could have a separate packet that has the control signal. I believe claim 8 actually illustrates it rather well. Is the module is further operable to transmit the control bits through the serial link between transmissions of the one or more serial data frames. So we have a situation when you could transmit the control information, then transmit the data, and then submit control in an alternating fashion. Or in claim 10, and specifically, we can have a circumstance by which we have one frame where we're taking the data and also the control and transmitting it as one grouping, a packet, a frame, as is, I was trying to avoid using the word frame, but it does have a meaning. And I think that's the meaningful distinction there, Your Honor, is where the data and the control is transmitted over that channel. There's no dispute that it goes over that channel, and that's required in claim 1 in all of the depending claims. It's just how is the data structured as it's going over that serial link.
I think I understand. Thank you. That's helpful.
That was all I wanted to respond to, unless the board has any other questions.
Anything else?
No questions for me. Thank you.
Great.
No questions. Thank you.
With that, we will conclude, and let me just say that we appreciate very much your efforts to be here, the explanations. We thank in particular petitioner for participating in our LEAP program. We're glad to have you. Thank you for doing that. With that, we will go off the record. Does our court reporter have any questions on spellings or anything of that nature? Great. With that.
The host or this meeting is being recorded.